You are listening to MCC GeoPod, the geopolitical podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
Welcome to all our listeners. It is the 16th of February, a beautiful and sunny day in Budapest. However, the warm weather and the joy it might bring to us is overshadowed by the fact that today almost marks the first anniversary of Russia's war in Ukraine. I am sitting in the studio with Dr. Attila Demkó, head of the Center for Geopolitics at MCC, and we are going to delve into the recent challenges on the battlefield and into the possible outcomes for this conflict. Dr. Demkó, thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much.
My first question is, how are the historical and cultural factors that have contributed to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think there is plenty of Russian historical perspective behind this conflict. So when we always talk only about geopolitics, and I also do that from time to time, you shouldn't forget the historical part. And the question is not if the Russians are right or not. I don't think the Russians are in any way right about Ukraine, because Ukrainians are a separate nation. For centuries, they were not taken out of the Russian nation. These nations grew together in a parallel way. The Belarusians are the third Eastern Slavic nations. So all of the nations of this region are actually the products of the last 1,000 years, not the product of the pre-1000 era. So, well, maybe the Kiev and Rus is the birthplace of all three nations, but it was a natural process. Of course, the Mongol invasion and played a role, but I think it's not a question that these are three independent nations. But in Russia, many sees Ukraine and Belarus as part of the Russian world. And it's not only an imperial outlook, and it's not about Russian autocracy, because sometimes in the West we frame this terrible Russian aggression in the framework of autocracy versus democracy. Many Russian Democrats view Ukraine as part of the Russian world too. And if you look at such giants like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he wrote quite a lot about how close to his heart Ukraine and the Ukrainian people are, and actually his ideas from the 80s and the early 90s, I think, influenced Putin and many others. And not only his ideas, because these are pretty much general ideas in parts of the Russian intelligentsia, that Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are basically one nation, and they should be united, and the West wants to break them apart, and they should stop this conspiracy, etc., which is, of course, looking at this from a Western angle, this sounds pretty weird, but it's not weird for many Russians. So the fact of the matter is that the Ukrainians are proving themselves very much a separate nation now, as they didn't really welcome the Russian troops. It's visible that sometimes Russian troops and Russian politics really thought that they will have a welcome they had in Crimea, but Crimea was different. In Crimea, there was a real and quite strong Russian attachment to Russia, since it became part of Ukraine just 2 or 3 generations ago, and with a Russian majority, and not only Russian linguistic majority. So that was different, and Donbass is also different. So what the Russians waited for, this warm welcome, in many places did not materialize. In fact, the Ukrainian population resisted very hard, even in Russian-speaking regions, with the exception of parts of the Donbass where Russians were welcomed. So even that picture on the West, that the Russians were rejected everywhere, that's not true. Even in the Kherson region, which was the most pro-Ukrainian from the occupied regions, even there it was 10 to 20% support for the Russians. But not what the Russians waited for, like the majority will support them. So yes, history plays a part. Geopolitics plays a part. It's a very it's not one dimensional conflict. There is, of course, a military dimension, cultural, historical dimension. Of course, there is a fear of NATO in Russia. We shouldn't forget this. So it's not a question if NATO wanted to attack Russia or not. It's a question how Russian military and security apparatus viewed NATO. And for them, Ukrainian NATO membership was an extreme red line, and they made it very clear. So that's another part of this question. But whatever it is, I think altogether Russia made a historical mistake with this open aggression against Ukraine. And in a 1 year's perspective, before the invasion until the last week, I thought that it will not happen because the Russian troops were far inadequate in size. These 200,000 troops were pretty much inadequate for the size and strength of Ukraine. So I didn't think, because of military reasons, that it's going to happen. But after it happened, after the first few weeks, I really thought that Russia will not win, except maybe for the Donbass. So it really visible that Russia is not as strong as we thought before the war, but not as weak as many thought after the first 1 or 2 months of the war. So Russia is ready for this war now to be continued for quite a long time, and they will definitely not give up. At the same time, Ukrainian resilience is remarkable in many ways. Of course, without Western support, Ukraine wouldn't be standing today.
What are the primary objectives of Russia and Ukraine in this conflict, and how have these objectives changed over time?
So yes, I think for Ukraine, of course, survival was the primary objective. And I think if that is how we define victory, Ukraine had already won. So Russia will not be able to crush fully Ukraine. They inflicted immense damage on Ukraine. So when we think about the future of Ukraine, I think it's extremely challenging, since Ukraine has lost some of the best and most talented parts of its population, either because they volunteered to the army and many of them died, or many of them who were competitive on Western markets, job markets, they left for the West. I know many Ukrainians, and some of the best and the brightest are now in Western countries, and some of the best and the brightest are in the military, and some of them already died. So it's a very tragic thing for Ukraine, but still it is a victory already, because the Russian idea that Ukraine can be, or a large part of Ukraine can be part of the Russian world, I think it's lost. A small part of Ukraine can be, but that's basically on the east. That's called the Donbass, and maybe Zaporizhia and part of Kherson, which is occupied by Russia today. So what were the other Ukrainian objectives? Of course, after a while, survival, the basic survival motive changed into the let's take everything back goal in Ukraine, which is, I don't think it's realistic. Because as I said, Russia is not as weak as it looks. And I think Russia has a very big red line in Crimea. So even if Ukrainian army would be able to defeat Russia in a conventional way, I think non-conventional methods, when we look at Crimea, would definitely be on the table if Ukraine could break, which would be very hard because there are only 3 entrances to Crimea. And of course, the Crimean bridge can be attacked. But even with that, it's very easy to defend. The longest line which the Russians has to defend is 7 kilometers. The other 2 entrances are basically 2-lane roads with many bridges which can be blown up. So it's very hard to break through to Crimea. You need an overwhelming force. So when German and troops were in Crimea in 1944, they could be defeated by the Soviet troops, but only with overwhelming force. So Crimea is and actually at the time Crimea was even more surrounded since the Kerch Strait, the other side of the Kerch Strait, was in Soviet hands too, and now it's in Russian hands. And definitely Russia has the Black Sea, while in 1944 Germany did not have superiority on the Black Sea. It was a very interesting time since Hungarian Navy fleet also played a part in taking German troops out of Crimea, and it was an extremely hard operation. So we have some perspective on how to defend Crimea or not. Russia has much better chances. So to go back, I think Ukrainian objectives changed, but maybe they are not fully realistic if we look at only what the population wants and what are the public statements of Ukraine. But what is realistic is that a Ukrainian state will survive, and definitely Ukraine will not be in a situation like Belarus. So Ukraine escaped that fate. As for Russia, I think the first objective must have been the full subjugation of Ukraine as a puppet state with a new government and on the full territory of Ukraine. And for me, I think knowing Ukrainians, I think it was mission impossible from the first second. Because even if there is a puppet government in Kiev with Viktor Medvedchuk or anybody else, I think Western Ukraine would have resisted that puppet government with arms if necessary, and large parts of the army would have never followed orders from Viktor Medvedchuk or any Russian installed new president, or Viktor Yanukovych or whomever. So in general, I think that the first Russian objective was mission impossible. The second Russian objective, today's objective, which is grabbing the land link to Crimea and the Donbass, on the primary level, it's attainable. So Russian army is adapting. In Western media and open channels, YouTube channels, and analysts are usually underestimate the Russian adaptation and overestimate the Western support's effectiveness. So I think we are entering the phase of not overwhelming Russian force, because Russia is not capable to generate overwhelming force, but definitely a period of stronger where the Russians are at least as strong in terms of numbers as the Ukrainians, and in other areas, not quality but quantity of artillery, they are much stronger. So the big picture, I think that Russia modified its original goals. Russia leadership is flexible. It's not rigid. They could withdraw from Kherson, which was militarily a good move. They could accept a failure, and they adapted. So they are not as stupid actually as they are depicted by some analysts in the West. But of course, the Russian army is far from being a first-class army. That's very clear. And Russian Air Force is even farther away. That does not mean that they don't have good troops and elite troops. So again, a generalization that Russian morale is low, yes, but not with special forces, not with VDV troops, and not with the best of the Wagner mercenaries. And again, the prisoner thing, that they use prisoners, that was a crude but innovative and effective method of breaking Ukrainian resistance in Bakhmut and Soledar. So I think both objectives changed, and Russian objectives are more realistic now, and at least what Ukraine openly says is less realistic than at the beginning of the war. So I think we were closer to peace in March 2022 than in February 2023, because the two sides are farther away.
Attila, a random question just sprang to my mind. You mentioned several minutes earlier that you know people who went to war willingly. Do you think that a large number of people, of Ukrainian people, volunteer to fight? I'm asking this because looking at my generation and the welfare present in our lives, I would honestly find it quite unlikely to sacrifice my life for my country, however much I like my country.
Well, I think Ukraine was in war for 8 years already. And there is a different perspective for many Ukrainians of what war is. We live in peace in Hungary and in Europe. We don't know what war is. And yes, we were not attacked in that brutal way as Ukrainians were. So we should think that the way they are thinking. And actually, I think many young Ukrainians volunteered to fight for their country. But that was the first wave. So I was in Ukraine last week. Enthusiasm is not that high now to fight. So, of course, the best and the brightest went, and the most patriotic people went into the army in the first few months. So those who were, let's say, less enthusiastic are now either outside Ukraine or inside and escaping draft. So it's not a fully bright picture for Ukraine. I think there is definitely exhaustion. There are, as we see, the forced conscription in basically all parts of Ukraine. That shows that there is a lack of manpower compared to the tasks which Ukraine is facing. But it's very natural. We have to see the size of the two countries. So Russia has at least 145 million plus the occupied regions of Ukraine. So almost close to 150 million people to recruit from. In Ukraine, if we look at the refugees and those who left Ukraine, including young men or draft age men, Ukraine is around 30 million people. Again, including the refugees. So if we look at, for a country to fight another country with almost 5 times the population, but at least 4 times the population, it's not easy. So Ukraine is definitely not a good situation, despite the high level of patriotism, which most of Europe can only admire. So definitely, I think that in most European countries, there would be far less volunteers to the army than in Ukraine. But again, we are not living in their situation. We don't know what aggression is for 8 years. We don't know what suffering is. We only know, especially in Hungary, in the last 10 years, every year until now, better and better life standard. While Ukrainians learned suffering in the last 8 years, learned how to resist an aggression. So it's a different world in Ukraine than in Hungary or in Europe.
Right. How has the conflict affected energy security in the region, and what are the implications for global energy markets? What do you think?
So that's another question, and I think here we have to be realistic. So Russia is not only one of the biggest gas and oil producers, but in general, in terms of raw materials, the number one country in the world, far beyond the United States or China or any other country. So Russian mineral wealth is amazing. So in that sense, it's impossible to take Russia out of the world economy, of global economy, and this is a very unlikely and unrealistic approach, unlikely to achieve major breakthroughs, and unrealistic to accept that Russia will just collapse under the weight of the sanctions, because there will be always many countries who will be happy to pay for Russian resources. And Russia actually managed quite well. So if I say that Russian military was underperforming in the last year, Russian economy was overperforming, and it seems that Russia prepared badly for the military, for the war, in terms of military, but prepared quite well in terms of economy. Russian economic policy was much more sound than Western, saving money, spending less than earning. And they also prepared the basis of an autarkic economy, which means that they will have the tools to replace some of the imports from the West. Some are irreplaceable, but some they are replacing. So actually, Russian economy is adapting quite surprisingly well. It adapted very well to the much smaller and less restrictive sanctions after 2004. So actually, after a while, Russia started to benefit from the sanctions. I don't think from these sanctions Russia will benefit in any time frame. Definitely, they will lose more money than they earn with let's say replacing imports with internal production. But still, it was unrealistic and very wishful thinking to think that Russia will collapse under the weight of European or American sanctions. It's not going to happen, at least in a 3 to 5 years time frame. And actually, some parts of the sanctions are weakening Europe more than they are weakening Russia. That's what we predicted at the Center of Geopolitics in March and April, and I think that's what is happening.
What do you think? What is the likelihood of a peaceful resolution to the conflict, and what steps need to be taken to achieve this? This is quite a hard question, I would assume.
Yes, on the short term, it's very unlikely that a lasting peace can be found because of what we talked at the first part of the interview, that both sides have a very different outlook how the war should end. I think back in March there was a formula which both countries could have accepted on Ukraine staying out of NATO, on a special status or even independence for Donbass. But since then, Russia annexed not only the Donbass but 2 other oblasts or counties or administrative regions of Ukraine. And this is an area, unlike Donbass, with a very strong pro-Ukrainian majority. I don't think it will fly with Ukraine in any way or shape or form until Ukraine is still have a strong military and a resistant society. But for Russia to give it up would be something absolutely against its image of a great power, and that would be definitely a loss for Russia. So what would be needed? Well, the most likely scenario will be in my view is that both sides going to be exhausted at one way or another in the conflict, and there will be no peace agreement, but there will be a freeze of the conflict, not a long-term resolution of the conflict. But sometimes freezing of conflicts is a more realistic way to end a conflict than to have a point at the end. So Japan and Russia still technically at war. North Korea, South Korea still technically at war. There are no peace agreements, no real peace agreement between North Cyprus and South Cyprus. So there are many conflicts which are basically frozen or half frozen around the world, and I don't see any better scenario, because the other scenario would be a full Ukrainian victory, but the full Ukrainian victory is impossible until Russian leadership and Russian state cohesion is strong, and it seems to be strong. And the full Russian victory, I think, impossible because of inherent Russian military weaknesses. So Russia cannot take all of Ukraine, and if Russia cannot take all of Ukraine, then there will be a bloody border on that part which it takes. So actually, I just don't see in a short time frame a reason to be optimistic that this war can at least freeze. But definitely one way, maybe a lack of, from both parts, but especially from the Ukrainian part, lack of ammunition, lack of manpower will push to have a, let's say, compromise, freeze of the conflict. And on the part of Russia also, the losses among the military, the internal discontent possibly can change the calculus of the Russian leadership.
Right. And as for my last question, what are the potential long-term consequences of the conflict for the region and also, and most importantly, for the global community?
Yes, for the region, we can see a very volatile region for a half a century at least. We saw that the Balkan wars ended more than 20 years ago. So Dayton Peace Agreement's anniversary will be in 2 years, in 2025, 30 years. And is it a stable place, Bosnia? Or is Kosovo and Serbia good friends now, more than 20 years after the end of the Kosovo war? No. So we can see a similar result in a much greater scale in Ukraine. So basically, 2 or 3 generations will definitely have an extremely bad opinion of the other. There will be for a while at least, a bloody border, even if the conflict is frozen between the two, with provocations, with attacks from both sides. So I see a very negative regional fallout from this war. Like from the wars of the Balkans, the effects are with us today. As for the global landscape, and that's the most important issue, because we are always approaching this, that Ukraine is fighting Russia, and the West is supporting Ukraine. So basically, Ukraine and the West is fighting Russia. But Russia is not alone in this. So China is definitely supportive of Russia. And some Chinese proxies like North Korea are already giving weapons to Russia. And of course, there is Iran, which is a middle power, but a very dynamic, in terms of military invention, a dynamic place. And that was a big surprise that Iranian military technology contributed to Russian successes in drone attacks on Ukraine. So I think we see that there is a coalition behind Russia. And this is the greater, global scale of this conflict, that we are seeing an East-West conflict. And unfortunately, in the 70s and 80s, it was China and the West against the Soviet Union. But today, we don't have Kissingers in the West, and we managed to fight Russia at one front, and there is another front which is still dormant, but it can break out in Eastern Asia. And if it happens, can we imagine that we already have a problem with supplying Ukraine, which is in Europe, which is a large country? So what would happen if there is a problem with Taiwan or on the South China Islands? How that region could be supplied while Ukraine is at war at the same time? So my take, and actually I wrote quite a lot about this, that the biggest question in this, if Russia and China work together or not. So was Russian policy totally independent from Chinese when they attacked Ukraine, or they had a level of at least understanding that it's the time for both of them to challenge the West, and maybe Russia will start it in Ukraine, and China will be silent for a while. But possibly China is also planning something, and also we have to see that it's not one-sided. That again, in the case of Taiwan, I don't think that we are always conscious of very deep Chinese sensitivities as well as the realities of international law, because in Ukraine the international law is with Ukraine, but in the case of Taiwan, international law is rather with the Chinese position. So anybody who supports an independent Taiwan would definitely support something that would break a long-term agreement, not only a long-term agreement between the US and the communist China, but also how international law looks at the two Chinas. So that's the big question: how China will move in the next few years. And it's a big question: how strong is America and Europe? Because it seems that even the case of Ukraine is a heavy burden, and China is 10 times bigger economy than the Russian, and definitely a bigger military than the Russian military. except for nuclear weapons. So a Chinese challenge would be even more formidable. Well, the Russians were underwhelming, the Russian challenge in many ways, but still it's a challenge. But we don't know how strong Chinese military is, but definitely it's bigger than Russian, for sure. So if there is a Russian, Chinese, Iranian alliance against the West, then we are in trouble, I think.
Thank you for providing us with your detailed answers and your expertise. This was the most recent episode of the MCC GeoPod, recorded just several days before the first anniversary of Russia's war in Ukraine. Thank you to all the listeners, and thank you to you too, Attila.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this MCC GeoPod episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.